On behalf of CPE, Bay Resistance, Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, welcome to Palestine Solidarity Announcements. This PSA is, I believe, our 6th or 7th PSA, and if you're new to them, these calls are a space for us to provide weekly updates on what's happening in Palestine, the most recent calls to action, and the ways that you can join the ongoing solidarity work for Palestine in the Bay Area. We're returning this week with a shorter show, but we'll have actually a conversation featuring Samer Arabi and Max Elbaum to talk a little bit more about the assessment of where we are today in our ceasefire movement. The agenda is as follows. We're going to start with a short somatics grounding practice from Melissa Fan again. And then Samer will give us some updates and what's happening on the ground in Gaza and some political developments. And then again, we'll open up the conversation for Max and Samer to talk about an assessment of our progress and some possible paths forward. And then we'll close with some information on what to expect in the week ahead. Thanks again for joining us. And with that, I will turn it over to Melissa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. So last week, our somatic practice centered on hope and practicing an embodied sense of hope, which is necessary to remain in any movement against colonization and for collective liberation. This week, our somatic practice will be centered on love. It's always a bit risky to talk about love in relationship to oppression and devastation. Love can seem irrelevant or trite or out of touch with the seriousness of the moment. But every great revolutionary talks about love as a central organizing and grounding force. Love is a regenerative form of energy which demands integrity. And operating from a foundation of love intertwined with hope allows us to stay in this movement for the rest of our lives without burning out. So to begin our somatic practice today, please get into a comfortable position. You can be sitting, laying down, standing, and begin to tune into your body. Simply notice the pace of your breathing. Notice the borders of your physical body from your feet all the way up to the top of your head. Just getting a sense of where your body is in relation to the space around you. Sometimes it helps to tap on your body. If you want to tap, just gently touch. You can tap, gently touch. And then tuning into your heart center. Maybe it helps to put a hand on your heart, or two hands, whatever feels accessible and comfortable for you. And I'm actually going to be reading two quotes from some of our movement ancestors today. And as I'm reading, just stay connected and centered in your heart, noticing what these words feel like in your body. Noticing what it feels like to receive this wisdom from our movement ancestors. So the first quote is from Ghassan Kanafani, who was a Palestinian writer and public figure, and who was assassinated by Israel at the age of 36. Everything in this world can be robbed and stolen, except one thing. This one thing is the love that emanates from a human being towards a solid commitment to a conviction or a cause. And once again, that quote is by Ghassan. Kind of funny. Noticing in your heart what that feels like to hear. And the second one is a poem by Black lesbian poet June Jordan in honor of Black History Month. This poem is titled Intifada Incantation, poem number 8 for BBL. I said I loved you and I wanted genocide to stop. I said I loved you and I wanted affirmative action and reaction. I said I loved you and I wanted music out the windows. I said I loved you and I wanted nobody thirst and nobody cold. I said I loved you and I wanted justice under my nose. Noticing what that feels like to hear. And seeing how that expands your own sense of love and the role of love in the movement for collective liberation. Thank you for practicing with me today.
Thank you, Melissa, for that very thoughtful grounding. Now I want to welcome Samer Arabi from AROC to share some updates on what's happening in Gaza right now and also some political developments.
Thanks so much, Thomas. I'm Samer. I am a member of the Arab Resource and Organizing Center. Each week I give a quick overview of the things that have been happening this week. And as always, it's been a really busy week. So I have not managed to capture everything in the 10 or so minutes that I have, but please forgive me for all the things that I will skip. And I appreciate your grace as I work through the things that I feel like are particularly important for this moment. As always, I like to start with what's happening in Gaza and then work my way up. So like what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in the Middle East, and then the sort of broader situation internationally, politically, and then zoom back in from there to here. So looking at what's happening in the US and then the Bay Area specifically. And it's been a big week for a lot of different reasons, some pretty horrific and some a little bit inspiring, I hope. It continues to be a really horrific situation in Gaza. The violence continues unabated. Last week I'd mentioned that the rate of killing has not reduced since the ICJ decision, and that trajectory remains pretty stable. So we're continuing to see over 100 dead every single day, and very little that we've seen in terms of an actual moderation that folks were hoping, given the sort of building international pressure. But the specific things that I wanted to focus on today are what's happening in Rafah, which is like the very bottom southern tip of the Gaza Strip on its border with Egypt, where the new hostilities seem to be really picking up. So Israel has stated very plainly and very clearly that their new target is Rafah, which was from the very beginning of this military offensive, the area that they said would be like the safe zone that they encouraged people to go to. So there's an ongoing question about how they can do that in a way that doesn't result in an even greater catastrophe than has already been happening. It's really not clear what that will look like, and it's actually spawned a lot of pushback from Israel's erstwhile allies that we'll get into, I think, a little bit later into this conversation. There's a really fascinating update this week about the hostages, a really heartbreaking one about the fact that a fifth of the hostages that remain in Gaza are presumed dead at this point. And this New York Times article was a really fascinating display of a kind of uh, a way that that fact has been sort of twisted and to fit a particular narrative. It takes them, I think, like 11 paragraphs to get to the very simple fact that overwhelmingly these are hostages being killed by Israeli bombs, which is something that I haven't had time to update this presentation, but I think the Israeli military put out an investigation just an hour ago that confirmed that at least a few of those hostages have definitely, well, they don't use the word definitely, but were likely killed by Israeli bombardments. And like the quotes in here are really something, talking about like one in particular about a hostage saying that the relentless Israeli bombardment felt as menacing as the kidnapping itself. But really interestingly, I think the article touches on, I think, the internal tensions within the sort of ruling coalition of Israel between the hardliners who won't accept a situation that would lead to a kind of like broader, more permanent ceasefire, and the more like center part of the Israeli political spectrum that won't really agree to anything that doesn't result in the freeing of hostages. So it's this sort of impossible tension that exists within that group, which partly explains, I think, the sort of stuck nature of the current Israeli body politic. Speaking of stuck, aid continues to be a really big barrier in Gaza, and there continues to be a real deficit in the amount of aid that's being delivered, given the scale of harm that the Palestinians are facing. This was something that was called out specifically in the ICJ report that genocide is plausible, was the lack of needed humanitarian assistance. And that continues to be the case. And on top of that, the limited humanitarian assistance that is being like allowed in is being blocked by Israeli protesters who have set up a sort of like camp city at the border to prevent aid trucks from going in. And there's a lot we can say about this, but the one thing that I just wanted to note from this is like a sort of dark irony of the displaced Palestinians in their tents and this like group of hardline folks who are trying to stop humanitarian aid in their tents. And the fact that, you can't help but notice that these are all the same tent, right? Like this isn't like a sort of like grassroots movement. This is clearly a sort of structured, planned, centralized effort at undermining like Palestinian life. Unfortunately, we don't have time to sort of go into the sort of broader violence that's happening in Palestine this week, but it's been bad. I mean, the one-liner here is that the violence in the West Bank continues to be horrific. We also don't have a ton of time to get into the broader regional impact, but I think the high level here is that the threat of a regional escalation continues to grow with every passing day. And we see the US is continuing to sort of engage in greater and greater levels of military engagement across the Arab world. There's a single day this week where the US bombed 4 different countries in the Middle East, I think. So things are looking very tense, and that sort of possibility of things, evolving into a regional war, I think continue to grow. The other sort of regional thing that, again, we don't have time to dive into too much right now, but I think is worth mentioning is this like the pre-October attempt to sort of normalize relations between Israel and various Arab authoritarian states is sort of starting to fall apart. And we can talk about the statement from the Saudi Foreign Ministry, maybe in our conversation with Max later, or what's happening with Morocco. But basically, facing massive public pressure, these governments are sort of backpedaling on their attempt to normalize relationships with the Israeli state. The uh, the big news, I would say, of the week in the region, or sort of like international engagement thing, have been these ceasefire negotiations that have been ongoing for a little while now, but are stepping up. And I think pressure continues to build for that ceasefire to happen. And just this week, representatives from Hamas proposed a three-stage ceasefire agreement where each 45-day stage would sort of, lead to a group of hostages from both sides being released and a sort of de-escalation of the conflict. And that proposal was rejected out of hand by Netanyahu, who said more or less immediately that it was an untenable offer. And then I think more or less immediately after that, a series of Israeli government officials said, well, okay, maybe not this exact offer, but an offer is definitely, like, it's time to make a deal, so to speak. And I think, there are a few different forces that are pushing that outcome. One, a realization that after 4 months of conflict, we're over 125 days now. Like, Hamas as a military force has not actually been like massively degraded, and that's like from U.S. and Israel's own intelligence assessments. And the fact that Hamas can set the terms of a ceasefire negotiation should tell you a lot about the sort of like balance of power in this situation, given where we're at. So it's a sort of, and again, this is maybe a conversation we can get into more later, but it's a sort of impossible situation for the Israeli military, because on top of losing on the ground, there's no sort of like political win here. After 4 months of only rescuing one hostage, and only managing to target two senior Hamas commanders, I think, over the course of these 4 months, one of whom was not even in Gaza. Like, it's just a horrific failure on every level. And, the human cost of it has, like, not that there would have ever been a justification for it, but even the stated justification is sort of falling apart. So the current status of the ceasefire negotiations are a little bit unknown, but they are ongoing. So there could be an update anytime, like in the next hour or in the next few days or in a few weeks. But the fact that those negotiations are ongoing, I think, is probably, broadly speaking, a good sign. The other big news this week on the national level is this appropriations bill that has been working its way through Congress for quite some time now. There was a sort of agreement between Republicans and Democrats, where Democrats wanted funding for Ukraine and Israel, and their sort of concession to Republicans was that they would include in that bill a series of, funding for like border police, but also a series of really draconian policies about how migrants would be treated and how folks would be deported and what powers like Immigration Service and the Department of Homeland Security would have. That bill was expected to be approved this week and then collapsed spectacularly in this really odd moment where, because Trump on the campaign trail said that the idea of combining border security and foreign aid was like a bad thing. And so Republicans abandoned the bill that they basically set up. So the whole thing just sort of fizzled out. The vote failed, and that aid did not end up going through. Immediately after that, there was an attempt to just do an aid to Israel bill. So a specific $17 billion aid to Israel, pulled out from the rest of that broader negotiated agreement, which even Biden, who, as a reminder, has been trying to get these $17 billion to Israel for the past 3 months now, said that he would veto it because it didn't make sense to do it separate from the other pieces of the legislation, but also because it didn't call for any humanitarian assistance or anything like that, which Biden now is sort of has been like politically cornered into committing to. It's worth noting that even though Biden said that he would veto this standalone Israel support bill, there were still 46 Democrats who voted for it. And these are also, unsurprisingly, the sort of more right-wing Democrats, or the ones that have been receiving the most money from AIPAC, and the ones who condemned the ICJ investigation into genocide. So just worth noting if any of those are your representatives. And just to round out what's happening with this bill, a new version of it has been introduced yesterday, which again contains a lot of the same horrific like Republican concessions, which include, for example, a prohibition on funding UNRWA, the Palestinian Relief Agency. So where that's going to go, we don't really know at this moment. It's not clear whether Republicans will support it or not. And so that aid to Israel continues to be suspended. And I just want to note that that's in and of itself, even just the delay is quite a big deal. And it's leading to a real lack of, Israel has used up all of its sort of military munitions, and it actually badly needs, as far as I understand it, this assistance, both for the salaries of its like massively mobilized reserve force, but also for the munitions that it has used up. So it'll be really interesting to see where that goes. This has also led to a moment, I think, where a lot of US political figures have taken a much stronger stand on what's been happening with the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. It's still pretty mealy and it's still, frankly, quite cowardly. But the fact that Hillary Clinton, who last week or 2 weeks ago accused ceasefire supporters of being headquartered in China, and now is saying that her quote was Netanyahu is like an obstacle to achieving a ceasefire. It's like, dude, you're an obstacle to achieving a ceasefire, but sure, we'll take it. Biden also has been calling Israel's response in Gaza over the top. So this idea that like pressure against what's been happening is growing, right? And it's growing slowly and insufficiently, but growing nonetheless. And that sort of tracks with, I think, broader public opinion, which is also continuing to shift against Biden's support for the genocide in Gaza. And that's particularly true for non-white Americans, and even more so for young Americans, over 70% of whom think that what Biden has done in Gaza is wrong. Despite the sort of shift in public opinion, we're still seeing a delay in the shift of the way that media is reporting things. So I just wanted to note 4 particularly horrific news stories that came out this past week. And they're all linked in this slideshow, which you'll have access to after this presentation. So if you wanted to go look at them, they're really something. I would love to go into some of those in more detail, but again, we're limited in time. The other news article that I wanted to mention very briefly is this Counterpunch article about like the ways that Palestinians are being treated on the global stage. Not necessarily for anything in the article itself, although it is a really interesting article and I'd encourage you to read it, but because of the response to this article from someone in the San Francisco District Attorney's Office who, using his work emailed Counterpunch to talk about brutal Arab invaders in Israel and Judea, which like is the West Bank, and basically telling them like, go back to where you came from, and refer to them as oppressive Arab invaders. So like sort of horrific, racist and anti-Arab sentiment that we're seeing from public officials here in San Francisco is really something. So for those of you who are in the city, that's a thing to probably say something broadly about, particularly in this moment as elections approach. And the last thing that I wanted to touch on quickly here is just to reflect on 2 very different paths that current candidates are taking in the local primary elections. On the left, you have somebody running for supervisor who sent out a letter to potential voters saying that, like, basically blasting the idea that San Francisco has a ceasefire resolution. And, he says that there was a resolution that, quote, in his letter, condemns anti-Semitism, anti-Palestinian, and Islamophobic rhetoric, and calls for urgent humanitarian aid and the release of hostages. And then he says, but that ceasefire doesn't call for the surrender and removal of Hamas. Like, that's a campaign tactic that somehow I think he expects to mobilize people to vote for him. But sure, I don't know. Meanwhile, there are district supervisor candidates who are openly calling for a ceasefire and who are calling out what's happening to Palestinians quite clearly and quite loudly, including Jackie Fielder in District 9. So I just wanted to highlight that sort of distinction. And as I always close out, I just note that, like things that we'd love to get folks plugged into, including protecting the students who walked out of SFUSD schools in protest of the war, the legal defense of the folks who blocked the Bay Bridge in favor of ceasefire, and then obviously stuff around the March primary election. And the final plug of, like, if you want to find things to get involved in, I always recommend that you check out AROC's events calendar. And if you want updates on things that are happening, please just, text our text alert number. And if you just send PSA, we'll know that you came from here. And so that's like my overview, which took a little longer than I was hoping it would. My apologies, but I'm really keen to sort of transition this into a conversation with my dear friend and colleague, Max Elbaum, who is an editor at Convergence Magazine. I hope you have read some of his incredible work, and is a longtime thinker and strategist, and a real leader in how we understand these sort of movements and this work. And so I think we're really lucky to have Max here today to sort of help zoom us out a little bit from the conversation I generally have been having with you each week, where I'm looking at a lot of really big details to sort of talk about where we're at more broadly in this moment. And so, Max, I wonder if, like, I can turn it over to you to give us just some, like, preliminary thoughts on where we're at and where we've gotten. It's been 4 months of people organizing against this genocide, and I think I'd love to hear your thoughts on how, like what we've won over this time, and how the sort of political landscape you feel like is changing or has changed, and maybe what lessons we can pull from that.
Sammer, before Max responds, could you stop sharing your screen so we could see both of you? And yeah, great, thanks.
Thanks, Summer. Well, I think the first thing I want to say is that in every racist imperial war for the last 150 years, there's always two things that come out afterwards that people didn't thoroughly appreciate at the time. The first one is that the toll on civilians and the indigenous peoples turns out to be even worse than was understood at the time. So your reports have detailed the horrors going on. We all have to realize that the reality on the ground is even worse. And years from now, that will be appreciated in a way that today is not fully appreciated. The second thing is that anti-war movements always have a greater effect than we understood at the time. This was true of the anti-Vietnam War movement, where my generation came up, true of the movements against the wars that the US conducted in Central America, in the Middle East. It's always greater. And the movement that we've seen since October 7th, October 8th, has been absolutely unprecedented in the United States politics, and is a real turning point. This is a watershed about solidarity with Palestine, and on what has been the third rail of US politics since World War II, the Israel-Palestine conflict. This movement has transformed the thinking about Palestine among the younger generation, in the trade union movement, among the base of the Democratic Party, among young Jewish people, and it has filtered up to affect things right into the establishment itself. We have not won a ceasefire. We haven't captured the main citadel of power over US foreign policy. But the impact of this has been a watershed. It has also struck what is probably a fatal blow against PEP, Progressive Accept Palestine politics. I don't think they will be able to put that genie back in the bottle. And the effect you, Summer, you laid out some of the change in rhetoric. This indicates that much deeper change is going on underneath what we see on the surface, some of which will be manifested and more of which we'll find out in 5 and 10 years from now. So everyone who has participated in this movement has made a difference, and a difference probably even larger than we can measure right now. The last thing I'll say at this point is that this has not only revived the movement around Israel-Palestine, the Palestine Solidarity Movement, which has been one of the most active of the international solidarity movements in the United States in the last few years, but this has changed the landscape about the importance of internationalism in general within the US progressive movement. This movement has put the US role in the world back at the center of progressive politics in general. And that is a very important achievement that we owe to the Palestinians, the Palestine Solidarity Movement here. People struggling all over the world owe a debt to what's been accomplished by this movement. So let me toss it back to you, Samer, to say a few words maybe about where you think we are in terms of winning a ceasefire and what might come after. And we can kick that around for a little bit.
Yeah, I would love that, although I lack your level of vision and thoughtfulness, but I will do my best. I really appreciate, by the way, your framing of like how I think Palestine has given us a sort of lens by which to see a lot of the other movements that folks, on the left have been struggling on for quite some time now. And there's a sort of, I think, beautiful synchronicity to it, right? That I think, particularly for the folks who have been organizing here in the US, that the sort of anti-war Palestine organizing, I think, is in many ways built on the shoulders of the sort of Black Lives Matter mobilizations and movements that happened a few years prior, right? So there's this sort of like continual, movements feeding into each other, which is, I think, always a really beautiful and inspiring thing to see. And I do think that it is fundamentally shifting U.S. political discourse in some way, and I agree with you that it'll be some time before we fully see what that looks like. But in terms of its impact on the likeliness of a ceasefire, I mean, we're all reading tea leaves, right? Like I don't think anyone can know in this particular moment where things are going to go. One thing that I know you and I have spoken about previously, Max, is like the scope of possibility in this moment feels so broad that because there's been a sort of like breakdown of like the US political system, it's really hard to know what particular trajectory things are going to take. So, just in terms of the role that the US plays, my money is on strong pressure for a ceasefire coming soon. Even Biden himself, is trying to avoid using that word, but you can always get a sense of what narrative he's pushing through his proxies. And there's a level of pressure on the Israeli military that, did not exist even a week ago. And it's been building to the point, I think, where at some point it will be intolerable. And the way that just this week, right, the State Department was speaking specifically about not agreeing with the idea of an assault on Rafah, period. And that, I think, is slowing the attack that is happening anyway, but those wheels are sort of already turning. So I suspect a ceasefire will come soon. And I think with sufficient pressure, we'll see that happening, in the next, I don't know, few weeks. And again, pure conjecture here, but that's probably where my money sits, particularly as it relates to the upcoming electoral conundrum that Biden has found himself in. Yeah, I can also imagine a situation where U.S. foolishness leads us into a regional war, but I think that's less likely, though certainly possible. And I'd be keen to hear, Max, like your thoughts maybe on that sort of electoral angle of it, how much it's impacting what's happening in Palestine, but also the other way around, maybe like what's happening in Palestine is impacting what's happening here.
Yeah, well, you're certainly right that there is a wide open range of possibilities of what happens next, which makes our activism all the more important. One of the interesting things about this moment that shows how much of a difference we've made is that Israel and its backers want to discuss absolutely everything except what Israel is doing in Gaza. They want to discuss anti-Semitism. They want to discuss the alleged sins of the UNRWA. They want to discuss Hezbollah. They want to discuss Iran. They want to discuss absolutely everything other than what Israel with U.S. backing is doing in Gaza. And it's been the movement, the global movement and the U.S. movement's ability to shine a spotlight and say, this is the central point. This is what is happening now to the people in Gaza that has given our movement the moral high ground and the political initiative that we have. Israel wants to drag the United States into a regional war because it's a way of avoiding talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict and shifting the conversation to the confrontation allegedly with Iran or with Russia or with whoever else. So that's what the Israelis want. And the Biden administration doesn't want that, which doesn't mean that they may not get us into it, because their way of trying to avoid it includes trying to appease Israel and play to a domestic audience by being tough against Iran and all that. But they really do not want a regional war. And this gets into the point you're raising here, which is it's a principle of politics that the divisions in the opponent's camp are a reserve of our movement. And we have to understand as carefully as we can the division between the Israeli government and the US government and the Biden administration. Every Israeli ruling group since Israel was established in 1948 has wanted greater Israel, has wanted the maximum possible land with the minimum number of Palestinians, and those Palestinians who are within the state being treated as second-class citizens in an apartheid type system. That's been the goal of every single Israeli government since 1948. There have been occasions when one or another Israeli government has felt they need to make some concessions and they won't get their absolute maximum goal. Those fleeting moments have come. And for the last 10 years, the Netanyahu regime is totally committed to greater Israel, no concessions whatsoever. The US government policy is somewhat different, especially since the Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah, who was a formidable ally of Washington in the Middle East. Israel has been a very valuable asset in what the US ruling class regards as a strategic area of the world, the Middle East, because of its location, because of oil, other reasons. But the center of gravity in the US foreign policy establishment has been that you need to make some concessions to the Palestinians to pacify the Arab world, to create a stable US dominance in the Middle East. So what their goal has been a Palestinian quasi-state that is perhaps a little more than a Bantustan in South Africa, but is less than a fully sovereign nation, and that leaves Israel to be the most powerful force in the region. And the US foreign policy establishment has seen that as a much more stable relationship, but the US government has never had the political will to push the Israelis to make even that kind of concession, even though they've argued that it's in Israel's best interests. And some Israeli politics thinks it is in Israel's best interests. But because of the power of the Israel lobby in the United States and domestic considerations, it's never been a top priority of the US to muscle that through over an intransigent Israeli government, which in part has to do with the fact that Israel has something that South African apartheid never had, which is a mass grassroots base in the United States made up of the Christian Zionists and the right-wing and the Jewish Zionist operations. But everything since October 7th has put this right on the table, and there is now a division between a government in Israel that wants greater Israel and a US that doesn't see that as a viable long-term strategy for imperialism in the Middle East. The only people in the US establishment now who see it that way are the Trumpists, who have decided their alignment, they believe only in military force, and they're totally aligned with the Christian Zionists and the right wing, and the Republican Party is totally aligned. But the Democratic Party leadership is not. And that's the leverage for us. This is where the leverage for us to force Biden even further by keeping up the pressure, intensifying the pressure, by defending all the people who are under attack from AIPAC and Congress, Summer Lee, Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar. If we successfully defend all of those folks electorally against AIPAC's attempt to unseat them, it's a huge blow to the fear factor that the Israel lobby threatens, and everybody just bows down. So that's a top electoral priority for us. A top priority for us is to defend every one of those seats. And if we do so, that's going to have a huge further effect on the transformations that are already taking place, and will have a big effect on the 2024 election. And if we haven't won a ceasefire by the time of these primaries, it will have a huge effect on the Biden administration. If there is a ceasefire, there'll be a reconfiguration, and we will be opposed to what the Biden administration wants to see in a at the end of this fighting, in the next stage of rebuilding Gaza, and their attempts to create some kind of client regime that would rule a quasi-Palestinian state that, under US tutelage. We're opposed to that. But that will be a different stage. Right now, we want to use this leverage that we have to win a ceasefire, and then move forward based upon the victory of having won a ceasefire over the opposition of some of the most powerful forces in US politics, in Israel, and in the world.
Do you think that thank you for that, by the way. really thoughtful, and I think, at least for me, really spot on analysis. Do you think that the reason for the sort of continued intransigence of the U.S. political class is that they sort of haven't caught up to the sort of change in the underlying political dynamics? You know, like I think you spoke to really well this idea that, you know, like an entrenched like pro-Zionist electorate and powerful like political action committees and things have really pushed the United States beyond its own interests in terms of how it's engaging with Israel, right? Like the idea of saying no conditions for what Israel does in Gaza is bonkers, right? And is pretty new. And I think for a lot of folks who are looking at it for the first time, probably kind of brain breaking, right? Like even Reagan, right, would call up Israel and be like, what you're doing in Lebanon is way beyond the pale. You're going to have to like pull back. This is a Holocaust, right? Was what Reagan said to Ariel Sharon during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And like the fact that Biden is to the right of Reagan on things like this, I think feels really crazy. But is your assessment from what I'm hearing from you, this idea that like the political class doesn't appreciate the extent to which their political fortunes don't necessarily aren't as dependent as they used to be on sort of like catering to the Israel lobby. Like if in fact these primaries go a certain way, right? Like so like the California Senate race, right, has one very Zionist candidate, one sort of like middling candidate, and then one strongly pro-ceasefire candidate. And like, will the result of that sort of create a broader political realignment, depending on what happens after the primaries?
I think that the foreign policy is the most closely held in the ruling class. It's the least subject to democratic participation, to popular pressure. It's the most insulated even from congressional oversight. It's held very tightly within the executive branch. And those folks are living in a bubble. They convinced themselves that the situation in Palestine was under control. Part of this had to do with the shifts that went on in Saudi Arabia and some of the other Arab countries, where those often police state regimes were more interested in collaborating with the United States government than in representing the sentiment among their peoples in solidarity with Palestine. They live in a bubble of who they talk to, donors, the rich class, and so on. They live in a media bubble, and they underestimated what was going to happen when the Israelis did what they did. They underestimated that badly. And this movement has taken them by surprise. And the degree of the fact that they're losing the entire global South, not just the Arab world, but the entire global South, and how isolated they are, they totally miscalculated. I mean, we shouldn't be thinking of the imperialists as these all-knowing people who are competent. They're a bunch of incompetent people living in a bubble, even the more realistic ones, not to mention the crazies in the Trump administration. So they blew it, and they're trying to catch up now, but they're behind the times, tremendously inertia, and they're scared as hell of the Israel lobby. You know, so they're floundering around. I mean, if they had the confidence that the Kennedy administration had in 1963, they've already done a coup against Netanyahu, the way the Kennedy administration did a coup against Diem in Vietnam in 1963. But these people got themselves caught up. You know, I was in a conversation with somebody the other day, said, well, where are the sensible imperialists? I mean, they're not even, an argument can be made, they're not even behaving the way in their own long-term class interests. So I think they're, you know, they're trying to catch up. They're scared, they're incompetent at doing anything except killing. And we need to keep up the pressure. And I think if we will, we can hasten their catching up. And I tend to agree with you. I think if I had to bet, I would say a ceasefire is more likely than a regional war, although anything is possible.
Yeah, that's really, really well said. And I think there's no better example of like the US political class going against its own best interest than what's happening with UNRWA, right? Which is a more or less US designed project, right? To sort of give Palestinians enough to sort of continue to exist on a really basic level. And the fact that they're doing this sort of performative defunding of UNRWA, which by the way, continues to not be based on a single piece of evidence, I think really just goes to show the extent to which they've sort of lost the plot here. But also, you know, to answer the question that somebody asked, like it's political pressure that's going to get funding back to UNRWA. It's the same. That bill is currently being negotiated. It's a inflection point, right? This bill, like no one knows if it's going to pass. There are huge interests from a lot of different places in getting it passed. And so getting the right combination of things in it is going to be critical for that. And so, like, as always, reaching out to members of Congress and organizing and what happens in this primary election, I think will really impact the appetite of Congress to continue to fund UNRWA, and on the flip side of that, to continue to provide military assistance to Israel without checks or regulations and without conforming to the Leahy law of, like, you know, military equipment can't be used for human rights abuses. I know we've blasted past our time limit, but honestly, Max, I could talk to you for another 2 hours. I don't know if you have any final words, but if not, I'll pass it back to Thomas for final announcements and things. But yeah, it's been a real pleasure. I hope other folks enjoyed listening to me.
Every
Yeah,
single
but
thing
Max,
we're doing is making a difference, and we should keep it up. And I think we have every prospect of making a big contribution toward Palestinian liberation and more generally against US militarism and interventionism.
Excellent, Samar. Thank you both so much for this illuminating conversation, and also for helping us ground ourselves in a real optimism about what's possible. Even though so much has been lost, I think that there is some reason to hope, given some of the breaks in the status quo that we've seen over the last couple of weeks that are directly a result of BDS, of ongoing direct actions, of a sort of a mass movement, as you said, Max, for ceasefire that is unprecedented. So appreciate both of you grounding us in all of that. We want to thank everybody for sticking with us. We just have a couple of announcements. I want to give Annie Banks the floor just to share a little bit about a couple of things that are coming up this weekend. And one quick programming note before that is that we're hoping to have some comrades from No Tech for Apartheid join us next week to talk a little bit more about that work. Being in the Bay Area, it is obviously important that we understand a little bit more about the war economy here in the Bay Area, and particularly how the tech sector is playing an integral role in supporting what some folks might call the first AI-enabled genocide in history. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Annie, and then we'll close it out right after that.
Thanks so much, Thomas, and everyone who's joining us. I'm putting links in the chat, and we'll go over this very briefly in our final minute. So just quickly, 3 upcoming things among many upcoming things. So please, this is not exhaustive in any way. Please check AROC's event calendar, which I've put the link to again, in which Samar referenced earlier. There's 6 events alone tomorrow, so please check that out. But tomorrow, Kids Rally for Palestine from 11:30 to 1:30, hosted by Families for Ceasefire at the Lake Merritt Amphitheater, in advance of the Gaza Solidarity Ride, a family-friendly 7-mile solidarity bike ride, which will start at 1:30 in the same place. Next week, on February 14th, OUSD families and community will be mobilizing for the Wednesday, February 14th board meeting. This is a family affair, and the families are asking allies to support and spread the word. Info will be updated and can be found on the bit.ly, which I've put in our chat. Again, this is not exhaustive. Please check AROC's event calendar for all the amazing events coming up. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie. And thanks everyone again for joining us. Please, as usual, let other folks know about these PSAs that are also hosted or recorded and maintained on CPE's YouTube channel. So you can check them out there. And if you're joining us, you'll also receive an email afterwards with some resources and information that were provided during this call. And until we see you next week, please keep up the fight and free Palestine.